So good morning, everybody. Like I said, I've been teasing this teaching for a while. I'm really excited to get to share this with you today. It's something that has been bouncing around in my mind for probably a couple months already at this point. So I'm just gonna, I'll share the news with you. Essentially, the whole point of this teaching: Jesus is the Messiah, um, and that's obviously something you already know. But to the people of the first century, the people who were around Jesus throughout his whole life, the disciples, people very close to Jesus, that actually wasn't that commonly known of a fact. So there is theology around this idea of the mystery of the Messiah. And so my I guess my topic verse for this teaching is Proverbs 25:2. And that verse is, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, to search out a matter is the glory of kings." And obviously, like I said at the beginning, we know that the Messiah, that Jesus is the Messiah. So it's not really a mystery. It's not a secret anymore that Jesus is the Messiah. So what's the whole purpose of this teaching? Well, in this teaching, we're going to start it by, I'm going to share what my thesis statements are, the real main points that I'm trying to make an argument for by doing this teaching. We're going to talk about the miracles of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, what the Jews expected from the Messiah. We're going to talk about what the disciples expected from the Messiah, even in their close relationship to him. One of my claims is that Jesus purposefully hid his identity. I'm going to explain why he did that and why I believe he did it on purpose, and then why this is important to understand, why it matters, and how we can apply it today. So like I've kind of teased already, what I believe that you would all come to agree with me at the end of this teaching is that Jesus intentionally withheld verbally the fact that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God, that he was the Son of David during his life and ministry. That he wouldn't explicitly state that he was the throne to the or he was the heir to the throne of David. Also, that the people of the time were not spiritually in tune enough. They didn't know their scriptures well enough to be able to identify the Messiah and understand what that meant for Christ's life on earth. And this is true even for the disciples. So that is really the juicy caramel center of what I'm going to be teaching around today. That Jesus intentionally withheld the fact that he was the Messiah, that he was the Christ, that he was the Son of David to the world. And, we start by looking at the miracles of Jesus. And when you're reading the Gospels, you sit there and you're reading them and you're in awe, right, of all the crazy, powerful things that Christ got to do and that Christ did during his ministry. And then at the end of a few, particularly in Mark, after these superhero moments for Jesus, where he draws the attention of so many people because they just witnessed a miracle, at a perfect moment for Christ to share the good news that he was the Messiah and that through him all people were going to be atoned and brought to God, he didn't do that. In fact, he did the opposite. He didn't draw light to the fact that he was the Messiah. In a few cases, he told people not to talk about him. So let's look at some of those. The first one that I want to look at is Mark chapter 1, verses 43 and 44, after Jesus heals a leper. So Mark chapter 1, verses 43 and 44, "And he sternly warned him and immediately sent him away and says to him, 'See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest, and for your cleansing offer the things that Moses commanded as a testimony to them.'" So Jesus, after healing a leper, which the Levitical law talks extensively about how you become ceremonially clean again after you have some sort of leprosy or skin disease. Jesus heals this man and says, "Don't tell anybody, but just go and do the ritualistic ceremonies for cleansing at the temple." So he explicitly says, don't say anyone or say nothing to anyone about what happened. So Mark 5:43 is another example of this. And this is after Jesus raised the young girl from the dead. He strictly charged them that no one should know this, And then he said that something should be given to her to eat, which I always find to be quite funny, right? After Jesus raises this girl from the dead, he says, now don't tell anybody about what just happened, and give her a snack, because she was just dead a moment ago. So give her something to eat. There's another one in Mark chapter 7 after Jesus heals a deaf man. He says, and he ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more they continued to proclaim it, which is interesting, right? So a point that I guess I'll make this point now. The Gospels aren't always in chronological order. They aren't always written the same between the four Gospels. Each Gospel is telling us a story, right? That's kind of the purpose of having four of them, is that each one has a slightly different perspective, and there's a different story that they're all telling. And this is I think this is one of the themes that Mark is trying to get across, is the fact that Jesus didn't want he didn't want all of this attention drawn to him after he works these miracles. And this being the last one in Mark chapter 7 that I'm going to talk about, I think it's interesting that it's worded, but the more he ordered them, not to tell anybody about what was happening, the more they continued to proclaim it. And that kind of sets up the future of the Gospel of Mark. There's another interesting record that I want to point out too, where Christ wasn't just telling people not to talk about him. In Luke chapter 4, verse 41, after Jesus healed many in Capernaum, it says, and the demons also came out from many, crying out and saying, you are the Son of God. And he, Jesus, subduing them, did not allow them to speak, because they knew that he was the Christ. So even the demons, they recognized that Jesus was the Christ, that Jesus was the Messiah, and he closed their lips so that they couldn't spread the news that the Son of God, that the Christ, that the Son of David was out and about on earth. And I hope you see from these four examples that throughout Christ's ministry, he was trying to keep his identity and keep his works quiet and somewhat secretive. And, I'm kind of breaking teaching protocol by not explaining why immediately after, but we will see why. But there's some more information I want to present before I explicitly state why. So there's the next part. We're going to talk about the Jewish expectation for the Messiah, what the Jews expected from this Messiah, which we know was very much so prophesied about in the Old Testament, the Messiah. So some things that we should consider before diving into this, put yourself back in the first century at the time of Christ. Consider what Israel looked like, what political state it was in. Then also consider our own fleshly desires, right? Think about why there was even a king to begin with in Israel. There was a king because the people wanted it, and God appeased them by giving them King Saul, and then thank God he gave them King David. So consider all of these things. Consider that Israel was under Roman captivity just shortly before Jesus was born. So at this time in Jewish history, it had also been almost 1,000 years since Israel had been united under one monarch. So there's a lot of anticipation, a lot of hope to have a king that comes about and unites Israel and gets them out from under the rulership of Rome. And if I put myself in the shoes of the first century people, I'm pretty sure that's what I would want too. I would want the Messiah to come. I would want him to break me free from Rome, and I'd want a united Israel that actually gets the promised land. That sounds pretty nice. So I can sympathize with them that that's what they would want. So I just want to now show a couple verses that would really, I guess, illuminate the fact that the Jews really expected a kingly Messiah, and not so much what Jesus did during his life on earth, but more of a king. So the first one, let's go all the way back to when God establishes his covenant with King David. So this is 2 Samuel chapter 7. We'll read verses 12 through 16. It says, when your days are fulfilled and you will sleep with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will proceed out of your bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, and the strokes of the children of men. But my covenant faithfulness will not depart from him. And when I took it from Saul, or my covenant faithfulness will not depart from him as when I took it from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom will be made sure forever before you. Your throne will be established forever. And we see this as a dual prophecy, right? There's bits and pieces of that that are true about Solomon, and obviously there's many parts of that, or there, it's also true about Jesus. So it's one of those cool instances of a dual-natured prophecy where there's an immediate fulfillment of that prophecy in Solomon, and then there's a future fulfillment of that in the Messiah. But this is one of the verses, one of the sections that would have set the tone for the Jewish expectation of a kingly Messiah. Another one is Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1. And this is maybe one of the more famous ones. It says, a shoot will come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. Right? That out of the bloodline of David would come a shoot out of the stump of Jesse, this king. And another one would be Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 5 and 6. It says, behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, that I will raise for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and deal wisely, and will execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell safely. And this is his name by which he will be called Yahweh, our righteousness. So I hope that from those examples you see that the expectation for the Messiah to the Jews was a king. And considering what was going on at the time that Christ was born, they really would have wanted a righteous king. Just like you think of the American colonies, right? They wanted a ruler that actually represented them and took care of them, had their interest in heart, and that's how the whole Revolutionary War happened. So the Jews wanted a king that represented them. They wanted the promised king from the line of David. And so this is kind of an important thing to realize and understand, right? This permeates throughout all of Israel, even the disciples, and that's who we're going to talk about next. But when we have a strong opinion like this and a strong desire like this, it really impacts our biases. Right now, as a Jew at that time, I have a bias for what the Messiah is going to look like and what it means when he finally does come. Something important to keep in mind as we continue on. So next up, let's talk about the disciples. And even during Christ's life and ministry with the disciples weren't able to break that biased expectation that the Messiah would be a king. And we're going to look at this soon, but right after Peter identifies Jesus as the Christ for the first time in the Gospels, which is an important point. We'll talk about it more in a minute. Right after that happens, 3 verses later, that's when Jesus has to say, get thee behind me, Satan, because Peter didn't believe that the Messiah was going to have to die. Right? And I just hope, as we're going through this, we see how hard it is to break the biases that these people have. So let's go to that record in Matthew chapter 16 at Caesarea Philippi. So it's Matthew chapter 16. Start in verse 13, and we're going to read through verse 20. It says, now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, who do people say that the Son of Man is? The Son of Man being Christ, or Jesus' title. And they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah, and one of the prophets. He says to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Which to us, right? As the readers in the 21st century, we're sitting here reading this and we go, duh, yeah, we knew that the whole time. But it's important to know that there's never been an interaction to this point where Jesus identified himself as the Christ to the disciples, which is why in verse 17, Jesus's response wasn't just like a sarcastic clap of good job, you've really been paying attention. No, Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my congregation, and the gates of the grave will not prevail against it. I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you forbid on earth must already be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth must already be permitted in heaven. And now look at verse 20. Then he ordered the disciples that they should not tell anyone that he was the Christ. And it's all like, why, right? And I'll tease this a little bit more, but when I have good news, sorry, my cat just jumped on my lap. When I have good news, I want to tell everybody. But Jesus is telling them not to tell people that he was the Christ. It's mind-boggling at first until you really start to think about why. So we'll continue to do that as we go through this teaching. I just want to look at a couple other examples like this where perhaps the thoughts of the disciples and people around Jesus weren't that he was going to or that he was going to be a king. Another one, let's go to Acts chapter 1. And this is after Christ's resurrection and after he comes back and he visits the disciples. Acts chapter 1 verse 6, it says, now that they had come together, they asked him, saying, Lord, is it at this time that you are going to restore the kingdom of Israel? So even after all that they experienced together, watching Jesus die on the cross, get resurrected, he comes back and he visits them, their hope and their expectation is still that Jesus is going to be the king and he's going to restore the whole, not the whole world. He's going to restore and be the king of the kingdom of Israel. And we'll see that again. Let's go back. We read this last week with Dave when he taught and he was teaching about the birth story of Jesus. I caught this one and said I realized I'd never recognized this before. Let's go to Luke chapter 2. We'll start in verse 36. It says, and there was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until the age of 84, who did not depart from the temple, serving with fasting and prayers night and day. And coming up at that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and speak of him to all those who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. They were waiting for they were literally waiting for somebody to come in and take back Jerusalem for Israel. So the whole point of going through these 3 verses is just to show that the expectation of everyone, the expectation of the Jews, was that there was going to be a king who came in and restored the kingdom. And that applied even to Jesus's closest partners, the disciples. So at this point, we've looked at the fact that Jesus withheld his title. We've looked at the expectation of the Jews. We've talked about, we kind of teased a little bit of why Jesus kept it a secret. Now let's actually answer that question. So why? You know, like I said earlier, when I have good news, I want to share it like right now. You know, if I get a promotion at work, I mean, you guys know this, the almost, you know, a couple days after it happened, the first thing I did was to get on here and I said, I have a praise report, I got a promotion. And before that, I was telling everybody. Why? Because I was excited. Could you imagine the amount of excitement that the disciples had when it finally clicked in their mind that Jesus was the Messiah? You know, wow. Or, you know, for Christ himself, the amount of excitement that he had in his heart that he truly was the Messiah. Wow. So why did he keep it a secret? And admittedly, there's no verse that cut and dry says why Christ would have kept that information quiet, why he would have continued to ask people not to share that information with others. So we have to do a little bit of extrapolating, but I think there is a lot of support for these 2 main reasons that I'm going to share with you, that Christ would not have wanted to spread the news in the public that he was the Christ, that he was the Son of God, that he was the Son of David. So, and it all goes back to the Jewish expectation of him being a king. That's really the fulcrum of this discussion, is that the Jewish expectation was that the Christ, was going to be a king for Israel. But, and this is point one, identifying the Messiah really can only be understood through the cross. Jesus wasn't just a king. You know, there's so many prophecies in the Old Testament about the fact that the Christ was going to be a suffering servant. But at that time, that's not what the Jews were expecting. That's not what they were thinking about. That's not what their focus was. To those who were attentive, though, this wouldn't have been shocking that the Christ was going to be a suffering servant. There's so many prophecies about it, right? Look at Isaiah 53, the likes of Psalm 22. There's a lot of indications, there's a lot of prophecies that the Messiah wasn't just going to be a king, but he was also going to have to suffer, right? So if Christ would have touted his title as the Son of David, the heir to the throne, the Jews would have accepted that, and they would have latched onto that, and they would have been just like Peter, and they would have denied the fact that Christ had to die to fulfill his purpose as the true Passover and the true Exodus. So they would have rejected the truth that Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of David, had to die to reconcile the world back to God. So, and I really hope that, you know, as you meditate on this idea, because at first for me, that statement alone didn't ring true. It didn't stick. It didn't seem like that could really be the reason. But I hope that as you meditate on this a little bit, that begins to make sense. The fact that the Messiah had to be understood in light of the cross, right? So, yeah, sure, Jesus could have gone around and he could have told people all the time that he was the Christ, but they should have been able to recognize it on their own. You know, think about a great teacher that you have, or that you had. That the best teachers, when you go and you ask them for help, they don't just give you the answer. They want to enable you to figure out the answer, right? And God has done that so much for us, and he did that so much for the people at the time of Christ, that they could have been able to figure out that Jesus was the Messiah if they would have spent some more time studying, right? Just like our teachers would tell us to do. You know, maybe you need to go back and study your notes again. So a good teacher doesn't just give you the answer. And also, like I said, this is point one still, that the Jews probably would have latched on to Jesus' kingship, not the fact that he needed to be a suffering servant that would have to die. Another reason, and this is point two, and I only have 2 points for this, of why I think Jesus kept it a secret, is that consider that Israel was in Roman rule, right? So if he would have touted himself as king, that probably could have had detrimental impact on his ministry, right? It could have cut his ministry even shorter. Where if Jesus would have gone around saying that he was a king, you know, all of a sudden Romans start hearing that, which is what happened anyway. They start hearing that, and they cut Jesus' ministry short because they see him as a threat to Caesar. Right. So I think that part of it actually was some wisdom as well, which would have been so hard. You know, gosh, that would have been so hard. I think we've all been in a situation where we have good news that we want to share, but wisdom tells us not to yet, right? That there's still a couple things that need to fall into place before we can really tell. And that's really hard. And I think that's another thing that was happening with Jesus here. You know, so I hope that you see those 2 points and that you can meditate on those 2 points for a while. One thing I do want to point out at this juncture, though, is that, and I think this supports what I'm claiming, I think this supports it, is that Jesus didn't keep it a total secret. There were a couple instances where he told people that he was the Messiah. So the first one that I want to look at, actually the only one that I want to look at specifically, is in John chapter 4. And it's to the Samaritan woman, you know, at the well. So I think this is verses 25 and 26. It says, to the woman says to him, or excuse me. So this is John chapter 4, verses 25 26. It says, the woman says to him, I know that the Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ, and when he comes, he will tell us everything. And Jesus says to her, I who speak to you am he. Now, why would Christ break this established protocol? We've looked through a couple of the Gospels. We've looked at a few examples. Obviously, I'm not saying that that's a comprehensive work, but I believe that Jesus established that his protocol was not to tell people that he was the Christ and the Messiah. So why would he do that in this instance? Well, to think about that, to understand that, I think you have to understand Samaria. Like, this was a community, and we talked about this a little bit last week. Samaria is a community that was somewhat cast off after the Assyrians came in and they sieged the city. They established their own religion. They didn't necessarily believe that there was going to be a Messiah in Christ. But this woman here in Samaria obviously knew a little bit. So Jesus telling her that he was the Christ, I don't think had a negative impact on his ministry, because it's not like Samaria was a center where all the gossip was going to get out. Most of those people didn't care that Christ was the Messiah. They didn't believe that Christ would have been the Messiah. They didn't believe in the Messiah. So it's not going to damage Christ's ministry in the sense that it's going to get out to Roman rule. Also, those people aren't going to grab onto that fact. So I think in this instance, Jesus is telling this Samaritan woman to bless her, knowing that it's actually not going to have any negative impact to his ministry, and that these people aren't going to grab onto the fact that he's the king. So in this one instance where Jesus actually does express that he's the Christ, I think it plays very well into the 2 points that I made before, that these people wouldn't have grabbed onto the fact that Jesus was king, and it wouldn't have hurt his ministry in the sense that it wouldn't have drawn much attention from Rome. So again, I think this shows that in Christ's life, he had to demonstrate a tremendous amount of restraint. I'm sure that every person that he walked by, he wanted to say that he was the Christ, right? And again, I'm kind of repeating myself. When I have good news, I want to share it. The word gospel means good news. When we have good news, we want to tell everybody. And Jesus being the Messiah, the Redeemer, the Christ, a person who loves everyone, I'm sure he wanted to tell everyone. And we see that here in John chapter 4, in an instance where wisdom dictated that he could tell one. Another thing that I think we should consider about Jesus's identity being called, or he being identified as the Christ. When you read through the Gospels, the first time that he publicly announces that he is the Son of God, that he is King, that he is the Messiah, is at his trial. And at that point, it's too late for people to latch on to the fact that he's the king, because he's already about to go and be killed. He's already about to go and fulfill the part of his messianic ministry of being the sacrificial lamb. It's too late for them to grab on at that point. And hopefully, I think all of us have thought about Psalm 22 as Jesus being up on the cross, and he quotes the beginning of that psalm, and that pricks everyone's heart to finish reading and finish reciting the rest of Psalm 22, and to realize that this really was the Messiah. I think that Christ announcing that he was king at that point should have done the same, because hopefully the people of the time had enough of the scriptures in their heart that they could have remembered that the Messiah had multiple duties, and that they were about to see the one that they weren't expecting play out in front of them. Anyway, another thing to consider is that when you look at the book of Luke and you look at Acts, at the beginning of Luke, during the birth story, Jesus is identified as the Son of God, as the Christ, but he's not throughout the entire book until the end, where he's identified as the Christ at the crucifixion and after. But when you go into the book of Acts, which was also written by Luke, right, he's identified as the Christ dozens of times. And going back to what I said earlier about the Gospels, they're trying to tell us a narrative. When you consider Luke and Acts as one writing, which I think we all should, it's one person who's telling one story, just a little bit longer than the rest of the Gospels. When you consider them as a group, it is telling a narrative by only calling Christ at the bookends of his actual ministry, and then at the beginning of the church, almost exclusively calling him as the Christ. I think that is trying to tell us something as the readers. So I've made my points. I think I've presented the information that I want to present. I hope that you can munch on that and eat it. But there's still a question to ask, and that's, why does any of this matter? Like, great, we learned something today, hopefully. We're taking a bit of information home with us that we can chew on and munch on and meditate on and think about for a little bit. But why does any of this matter? Why was I so excited to teach this? And there's a few points that I want to share on why I think this matters. The first one is that we really need to understand as Bible readers that we have a privileged position when we open our Bibles. When we read the Gospels, we go and we already have the preconceived notion that Jesus is the Messiah. There's so many other instances of that. When we open our Bibles, we have a preconceived notion. We already know the salvation story. So sometimes we can become insensitive to the people of the time. For example, this point too, when we're thinking about the ancient people and how much they missed it, right? I mean, how many times when you're reading the Old Testament and Israel's wandering around in the wilderness and they're just sinning out of their minds, even though God is there right next to them working for them, that how many times have you just said, wow, these people are dumb. These people are they're so dumb. And as I've studied this and thought about it, the question has come to mind for me. If I was a first century Jew, would I have recognized Christ as the Messiah in fullness? Would I have seen him working a miracle and realized that's the Son of God, that is the King, and that is the one who's going, he's going to be the suffering servant? Would I have recognized that? And I hope that the answer was yes. But for me, I think the answer is somewhere more in the lines of, I don't know. And I hope that this same question pricks you in the heart as much as it did for me, because I think it's still applicable to the future. And I think that's why this teaching is a great springboard to talk about Revelation and talk about the end times, because, sure, we can't go back in time and figure out if we actually would have identified Christ as the Messiah, but there's still a lot that's left to happen. There's a lot that still has to be done in the story for salvation, in God's plan for salvation. And there's still a lot of it that we're going to witness and see. So how much of that am I going to be surprised by? How much of that are you going to be surprised by? And the question, the way to know that is the same as it was back then. It's how much scripture have you read? How much do you know? How much are you confident in? So again, that's why I think from here on, we're going to do a little bit of eschatology. We're going to spend some time in Revelation. We're going to talk about end times, because I don't want to be surprised about the end times like these people were surprised about the Messiah. And I don't want that for you either. So in conclusion of this teaching, I just want to recap everything one more time. I want to recap everything that we talked about today. One, that Jesus intentionally withheld the fact that he was the Messiah, that he was the Christ, that he was the Son of God and the Son of David during his ministry. Two, that the people of the time, they were not spiritually in tune enough to identify the fullness of Jesus's messianic ministry. And three, that included the disciples. Not even the disciples knew fully who Jesus was and really could wrap their head around it until after the crucifixion. Right? So those are my theses. Those are my thesis points. And I hope that after hearing my arguments that you will come to agree with them as well. And then in conclusion, right, as readers, we have to understand that we have a privileged position when we read, and that we should also consider what we don't know, and that what we're missing, and that we may be surprised as we move forward in God's plan for salvation, and that there's something that we can do about that right now so that we're not surprised as we march forward in that timeline. So that's why we're going to spend some time in Revelation and eschatology. But my last in conclusion point, and the one that I'm most happy about, the one that I'm most proud about, the one that I'm most excited about, is that Jesus is King. So that is the theology that I wanted to share with you about the mystery of the Messiah. I hope you enjoyed it. God bless you. Amen.